recent articles in your forthcoming book, you explore the impact in the afterlife of the Spanish Civil War in Latin America, both from the point of view of far-right actors inspired by Francoism and from the point of view of left actors, progressives, revolutionaries inspired by the Spanish Republic. Could you begin by telling us about how your project came about, how, when, and why you started working on the Spanish Civil War and reckoning with its impact in Latin America?
Yeah, so it was an accident, and it came about as I was preparing for teaching. So one of the classes that I teach is a survey history of Latin America from independence, the early 19th century, to the present. And I was looking around for new translated primary sources that I could assign to my students. And just by happenstance, I read in the same week 2 very different documents that, had I read them a year apart from each other, I might not have connected them. But because I just happened to read them in the same week, it was this sort of serendipitous thing. The first document was the declassified transcript of a conversation between Henry Kissinger and Augusto Pinochet in 1976. Kissinger was in Chile for an OAS meeting, and they had a kind of private conversation. And in that conversation, Kissinger is saying, you know, I love Chile. What a great country, such nice people. And Pinochet says, yes, this is a warm-hearted country of people who love liberty. But, you know, it's interesting because this thing that's happening and that's been happening in my country is a further stage of the same conflict that was born in the Spanish Civil War. And I'm going to bring it to an end, basically. And I was reading this and I thought, that's funny. It's funny that Pinochet is sitting in Santiago de Chile in 1976, talking to Kissinger about the Spanish Civil War. Why would he do this? Why not talk about the Cuban Revolution or Vietnam or something that's sort of more germane to that moment? So I kind of noticed that and set it aside in my head. And then a couple of days later, I was reading the memoirs of Sergio Ramirez, who is a Nicaraguan intellectual and poet who was part of the civilian revolutionary directorate that ran the Sandinista government in the years after the triumph of the Sandinista Revolution in 1979. And so in his memoirs, which had just been translated into English by Duke University Press, he's talking at the beginning about sort of why did we fight? Why did people in Nicaragua how did we acquire the temerity to imagine that we could overthrow the dynastic Somoza dictatorship that had kept our people in chains for 40 years with the support of the United States? And so he's talking about the sort of different inputs into the revolutionary struggle in Nicaragua. He's saying, you know, of course we were fighting against Yankee imperialism and the way that the United States had throttled all of our legitimate demands for, you know, democratic opening and social change. We also thought of ourselves as part of the global left of the 1960s. We also, you know, were inspired by the ongoing movements for decolonization in Africa and Asia. We were, of course, mindful of the crushing of Allende's democratic project in Chile in 1973. And further back, we carried with us the broken hope, la esperanza rota, of the Spanish Republic. And I thought, that's weird that a Nicaraguan intellectual reflecting in the 90s on a social movement that he had been a part of in the 1960s and 1970s would reach back to the Spanish Republic as a kind of point of inspiration for the struggle that he became such a key part of. And so it was because I had read these 2 very different texts in the same week by these 2 different figures who were so important and kind of indexical of the far right political imaginary in the height of the Cold War and the kind of radical left political imaginary in the height of the Cold War, culminating in the Sandinista Revolution. Why is it? How could it be that they both immediately pull to the Spanish Civil War when trying to account for what it is that they think they're doing, what their political horizon is? And so it was really from that quite serendipitous little experience of encountering these texts at the same time that I started looking for mentions of references to Spain and the Spanish Civil War in this much later period in the Latin American context, and just started finding them everywhere. And, you know, and that is true in disparate theaters of, whether we're talking about musicians, poets, the history of sports, like all kinds of bizarre little places where mentions of whether it's Spanish exiles or more commonly just this idea of what people thought the Spanish Civil War was, and that having informed how they thought about who they themselves were and what kinds of projects that they were working on, how frequently I started coming across these different mentions. And so really the project that became this book that I'm finishing now began as me just trying to aggregate and combine and put together all of these different little references and mentions and see what they added up to. And what I think they add up to is something that tells us that helps us explain quite a bit of the intensity, the ferocity of the cycles of revolutionary and counter-revolutionary political violence that defined Latin America's history in the second half of the 20th century, and the legacies of which continue to this day. And in trying to think with and about how to frame that, I found really helpful the writing of Kristen Ross on the sort of afterlives of the Paris Commune and the structuring effects of the Commune on French social and political imaginations sort of ever after, in which she talks about the idea of the survie of the Commune, right? That it's not so simple as saying, okay, there was a historical event and then I have these afterlives that are sort of separate from it. That instead, by thinking about the survie of the Commune, we have to kind of consider those afterlives or legacies or subsequent invocations as actually part and parcel of the original event itself, as originating from its elemental logic. And so I started to come to see what in Spanish you would call the supervivencia of the Spanish Civil War in Latin America, kind of in a similar way. I found Ross a very helpful sort of roadmap in that respect for seeing the ways in which the Spanish Civil War played out contemporaneously in Latin America, but then more importantly, I think the ways in which it's been invoked and played with and looked to in the aftermath as actually emanating from the logics of the Spanish Civil War itself in ways that have not gotten a lot of attention, because most folks who think about the Spanish Civil War are thinking about Europe. They're not thinking about the Americas. And so if you think about the Americas, you kind of see a bit of a different story. So that's how it all got going.
So yes, so your project certainly talks about the importance of the lens of the Spanish Civil War in the history of South America, both before, during, and after the Cold War. But I would claim that it does not only do that it has a particular heuristic value for our post-Cold War era. I mean, one that could start around 2015, 2016. And our claim would be that it has a particular heuristic value for two reasons. One is that there are three striking similarities, which would be the fact that there is a remarkable solidarity despite differences in what could be called the reactionary international, sort of the neo-fascist of today. That there is a growing propensity from centrists of all stripes to sort of accept the fact that, well, maybe the time has come to make an alliance with the far right. And the problems of the left, not only to resist, but to know how to resist and to wonder what to do about liberals in this form of resistance. These things seem very present, very current, but at the same time quite reminiscent of the 30s, and in particular in the context of the Spanish Civil War. So that is one way in which I think it's crucial heuristically. And another one would be that as you show, it your book, or at least the lens that you choose, displaces a vision of the Cold War based on an East-West, Washington-Moscow divide, but it also complicates what would be the major framing of the second part of the Cold War, which would be more a North-South divide in a way, by sort of reviving something that seems to be very much in a moment of revival, both on the far right and on the left, which would be a fascist versus anti-fascist lens. So now that I've totally preempted your answer to my question, how did you frame your project vis-a-vis our current situation?
Well, to rewind to the beginning of the question, I mean, I think I would push back a little bit on the post-Cold War periodization. I mean, I think that particularly when we are looking at and trying to understand the internal dynamics in parts of the world that are not the United States and the Soviet Union, that the periodization of the Cold War, I think, produces or at least sort of facilitates interpretive confusion. And so one of the things that for me has been really important in thinking about the Spanish Civil War in Latin America in the 1930s is that, like, 1945 is not, and the end of the Second World War means something quite different in a Latin American context than it does in a European one, right? And so maybe if we don't actually see 1945 as this caesura, right, the sort of definitive break, that there was a before and there was an after, then that makes it, I think, more possible for us to see important lines of continuity and persistence across these sort of artificial barriers. And so in the same way where I think one of the things I'm trying to do in the book is kind of argue against, for this one part of the world, the idea that 1945 is a watershed because of, there are other reasons you could make a case for 1945 being important in Latin America, but it's not really the end of the Second World War, actually. That logic then has to hold on the other end, that actually perhaps 1989/1991 is not, that neither is that a good bookend for the other end of this period of historical change and conflict that folks in the Latin America space sometimes will call the century of revolution, that began in 1910 with the Mexican Revolution and concludes in 1990 with the defeat of the Sandinista Revolution. That's a different historicity than thinking about the Cold War as the kind of primary temporality that we want to apply to this history. So I don't know that the post-Cold War, I'm not quite sure what to do with that, but maybe you can tell me more in a minute. Nevertheless, obviously, I think, in this kind of moment that we're in of global far-right resurgence, there has been enormous amount of debate about the sort of value of the 1930s for understanding our present, right? This is the fascism debates, quote unquote. This is, a lot of kind of nominative disputation over whether or not Trumpism is fascism light, is it fascistoid, is it, at the end of the day, I think that I don't personally have a huge stake in that current of disputation. I'm just more interested in, honestly, like the thing that I'm most interested in actually across all of the work that I've done is, like, how do people think of themselves in historical time? How do people situate themselves as part of lineages, as part of practices, traditions, whether they be practices of resistance or traditions of order and maintenance and status quo? Like, how do people use what they think the past was in order to organize their political commitments and their political projects in the present? And so, a thing that is very striking to me about this moment of far-right resurgence that does very clearly track onto the Spanish right in the 1930s and the kind of ideological bases of what becomes the Franco regime is this sort of, resurgent Christian nationalism that very openly harkens back to the Reconquest, to the Crusades, to the, triumph of the Christian kingdoms of central Spain over the Muslim caliphate of Al-Andalus and the final expulsion of Muslims and Jews from Spain in 1492, and this sort of revival of the mythology of Christopher Columbus. This is something that we see both in the kind of Trump universe in the United States, but also very much, one of the first October 12th, which is the anniversary of Columbus accidentally washing up in the Bahamas, the first first October 12th, in which Millet was president. He put out this just like truly hilarious, kind of AI slop video, basically imagining himself aboard the Santa Maria as it's sailing across the Atlantic Ocean to discover and bring God and civilization to the barbaric, heathen New World or whatever. And that kind of projective, affective identification with the forces of Christian conquest is something that was essential to Franco's consolidation of power in Spain. It is something that we see certainly all over the contemporary Spanish-speaking right, whether that is the sort of Vox universe in Spain itself, or it's Latin American homologues in the persons of Millet, Bukele, folks like that, Cast in Chile. But we also see it in like the tattoos on Pete Hegseth, which quite explicitly say, we are going to do a new Christian crusades all over the world in order to destroy the infidels. And that is a way of situating oneself in historical time and of recruiting a certain vision of the past in order to serve the needs of the present that I think is extremely dangerous, but has proven itself to have a lot of staying power. And so, I can't relate to why that, I can't personally relate to why that feels like a unifying and winning right-wing discourse, but I think it quite plainly is. It is getting the forces of reaction somewhere. It is serving as glue to hold together coalitions of folks who actually have quite disparate opinions on things like, should there be a confessional state in the United States? What should be the role of, Christian practice in the organizational and institutional frameworks of governance, stuff like that. And so that's one parallel, I guess. Let me return to the sort of the three pieces that you enumerated in your question, because I think that's sort of the first one, right? Like, what are the bases that the reactionary international can cohere around, in addition to the most fundamental and obvious thing, which is just their material interests, right? And I do think that this kind of particular Christian eschatology is one of the elements there that is important for us to understand, and which doesn't have an analog on the left, actually. Then there's the question of the centrists and the liberals, and why is it true, in fact, could we extrapolate from the case of Spain and say that liberals will reflexively always make common cause with the far left, with the far right, when presented with a threat from what they perceive to be a threat from the left? And I think that that's certainly true at the level of, politicians, sort of bourgeois fractions. They have a common set of interests in the maintenance of order, in the preservation of norms, et cetera. But I think, this is a little bit more complicated if we think about the present moment. For example, here in the United States, where I think that there are tons of everyday people who live in the United States who either don't think of themselves as political at all, or else would think of themselves as kind of, centrists who believe in a kind of, sort of minimalistic set of political and social freedoms or whatever, but who, when confronted with ICE coming in and, wreaking terror upon their community, have organized themselves, and I'm thinking obviously of Minneapolis, in ways that are very clearly anti-fascist, even if they are not themselves using that language or making recourse to that historical tradition in order to explain what they're doing. And we will have all seen, these sort of clips of everyday people saying, I've never been to a protest before, I've never done anything like this before, and then ICE kidnapped the dad of one of my kids' classmates at their preschool. And that's unacceptable. And so now I'm getting up at 4 a.m. every day and driving to school kids of undocumented or mixed status families so that they don't get picked up by the ICE Gestapo waiting outside their school. And so I think I would hesitate to say that that it is axiomatic that the centrists and liberals will always defect to the far right when the question is called. I think we have to look very carefully at, okay, well, where in the society are a particular set of centrists and liberals located, and look at basically, the sort of questions of class and class affiliation in order to, and access to power in order to try and map out how they will behave. But certainly in the Spanish context, and I don't know if you want me to do a 2-second primer on the Spanish Civil War, because I feel like this is, okay, because this is a history that I certainly didn't know all that much about before I started researching this project, to be quite frank. I knew the basic outlines, but really not, I had in my head that the great story that is the anti-fascists versus the fascists and the destruction of democracy at the hands of fascism abetted by the Western powers, and that's it. And that is still the big story. But within that story, I think there are some textures that are more useful actually for understanding precisely that second dynamic, the sort of what to do with the reflexive secession or exit of liberals from Popular Front-ish coalitions that also include socialists and communists and people of the ideological left. And then the third piece, which is the sort of question of left-wing strategy when trying to conceptualize mobilizing against whether you want to call it fascism or far-right authoritarianism or whatever term you want to use. Is there a kind of recruitable past in the history of the Spanish Republic that could be useful in that regard? And that, I think, is an open question. I think the closest analog that I'm familiar with would be the pink tide in the Americas. And there, the similarity to some of the reforms that the Republic tried to institute in the first 2 years of its existence in 1931 and 1932, agrarian reform, secularization, stuff like that, reform of the military, had a similar dimension in that the backlash that both of those reformist projects engendered, both the Republic in its moment in the early 30s and the pink tide in what has produced the current far-right resurgence in Latin America, which is very clearly a response to the pink tide, right? In both of those instances, the backlash is produced not because the modernizing, left-ish, secularizing, whatever reforms were so radical, but actually because they were not radical enough. What they did was to make some changes that diminished the power and influence of established sectors, but did not go so far as to defang them. And so actually agitated and activated, provided the right with something to mobilize around, did enough to basically anger them, and not so much as to actually eliminate their ability to remobilize and then regain control of the levers of power. And so that is an interesting, I think, parallel that I've been thinking about a lot, which is not to say, well, therefore it would have been so easy for, the pink tide to, nationalize everything, and then there wouldn't have been a backlash at all. It's not that, but it's thinking about sort of the extent to which when any kind of coalition that includes the left is able to actually gain power in a particular national context, is the move to be as moderate as possible, to make sure that that we take great pains to smooth off the rough edges of the radical project that we're envisioning, or is the move instead to swing for the fences while you can, because the backlash will come anyway. And that, I think, is I don't generally like to think about lessons from history, but that, I think, is actually like a pretty good lesson from the experience of the Republic, with its infinite fragmentations, self-sabotage, all of the ways in which it was not, I think, the kind of project that we would necessarily want to look to as a model. They did try to do some pretty radical things within the context of their time. And I think where they stopped short was what actually created the space for the enormity of the right-wing reaction against them. I don't know if that answers any of the
it does.
million elements to your very rich and multifaceted question, but that's my first stab.
Yeah. We'll get back.
Yeah, of course. We always get back. That's how we do. Recursively, endlessly.